Welcome to the Three Haunted Podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
What's up, everybody? This is your co-host, Ashley Lunar Goddess, Gorilla Girl filmmaker and horror-loving cinephile. I'm just your average podcast-producing badass.
I'm BJ Seura, an aspiring paranormal musician who plays live for the dead because the living just doesn't want to hear me.
What's up, goals, gals, and all of our spine-chilling readers out there? In today's episode, we'll be discussing horror novels and the paranormal with special guest, international best-selling author Jonathan Dylan Barker. Welcome to the show, JD.
Hey, how you doing?
I used your full name.
Nobody uses my full name. So I grew up with six guys named Johnny in every class. So I became JD at a very early age.
So when you meet people, is that how you introduce yourself, just JD?
Unless you're at the customs or at the airport when I'm getting back in the country, those guys want the full name. But yeah, everybody else is JD.
I go by my middle name. I grew up in the South and I was called by my middle name. So I don't go by my legal first name unless I'm at the airport.
Well, it's funny because when I come back into the country, my full name is on my driver's license, so that's what they look at. And I'll go into someplace like Istanbul, and they'll ask me why you're in the country, and I tell them I'm an author, and they'll Google my full name and get nothing, So then I got to explain the whole thing to them. So
you're like, why would I lie about that?
Yeah.
Well, that's funny because I don't go by my full name either. I go by BJ, which is Bob Joseph. So
there you go.
Have that in common.
Well, I mean, what isn't a name? Isn't that what Shakespeare said? So, so JD, how long, and I'm sure this is the first question you get with a lot of people, how long have you been writing?
Pretty much my entire life. It's one of I grew up without a TV in the house, so I was reading at a really early age. My mom used to take us to the library all the time. So I started reading around 3 years old, and I read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews by the time I got to kindergarten. Then I moved on to Charles Dickens and, some of the classics. I've got a sister who's 15 months younger than me. So I would write up little short stories, just make stuff up and staple it. And I kind of created my own little library in the house, and she'd check out the stories. I charge her late fees, and, I just kind of started way back in the day. But it was one of those things. My parents encouraged writing, but they always added this caveat. It's a great hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So they pushed me into the corporate world.
You proved them wrong.
They still don't believe me.
They're like, yeah, that's cute, but what do you really do?
Yeah.
So you started.
How are things really going? Yeah.
Exactly. So you started with Nancy Drew Hardy Boys and progressed on to the classics. At what point did you switch to thrillers and true crime and paranormal?
I think it honestly happened for me. I was 8 years old. My mom owned an antique store, and we used to go to a lot of garage sales. And I remember going to one, and this guy had a box of books, and they were 25 cents each. And sitting right up on top was a copy of Dracula. And I was 8. I didn't think my mom would let me buy it because it looked pretty scary. But she said okay, so I picked it up and I took it home and I read it, pretty quickly. And then I kept the lights on in my room for the next 3 weeks. I was scared half to death. And that's the first time I ever had an emotional reaction from something that I read. It seriously freaked me out. And I've been chasing that feeling ever since, either as a reader or as a writer. So I think whenever I write something, that thought is always in the back of my head.
Now, it's funny you mentioned Dracula being the first, segue into horror for you and leaving that impression because you co-wrote the prequel to Dracula, didn't you? Dracula with Dacre?
Yeah, it's funny how those things work out. So my first novel came out. It was called Forsaken, and it was up for the Bram Stoker Award for Best Debut Novel. And I was at the convention for this, and at one point there was a book signing, and I ended up sitting next to Dacre Stoker, who's Bram's great-grandnephew. We were together for about an hour, and I asked him every question I could think of related to Bram Stoker. I figured I'm going to take advantage of this. And he asked me a lot of questions about my background, and I had worked as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. I did that for almost 20-some years before I started writing my own known stuff. He asked me a ton of stuff about that, and I thought that's all it was a conversation. And a couple hours later, he pulled me aside and said, "Listen, I've got to admit, I knew who you were before we sat down. I arranged for us to sit next to each other, and I learned that this was really a job interview. His family had been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a very long time. They had access to all of Bram Stoker's notes and journals, all this really cool material, and the fact that I had worked as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, and I had that experience, like that was, between that and my writing style, which they seemed to really like, it seemed to be the perfect fit. So that's kind of how that project came together.
That's amazing. Now, I always have a problem with talking to like people that I adore, right? Like it's hard to know what to ask them, right? Or how much to ask, or all of that. And I guess as a writer, or when you're talking to other people, like, do you ever run into that? Do you ever run into like almost like just too much of a fan, right? Or is it at this point you're past it?
Yeah, I don't. I'm autistic. I've got a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome. In today's world, you're just on the spectrum somewhere. They don't give it a name. But I think because of that, I'm kind of fearless when it comes to that sort of thing. I'll give you an example. So I was at Thriller Fest one year, and Lee Child got in the elevator with me. So I had 15 seconds where I could either stand there and watch the numbers, fly by above the door there like everybody else does, or I could talk to the guy and try, potentially get a blurb for a future book out of them. So I started the conversation, because I am way more afraid of hearing or of like not asking the question than I am of hearing no. You can tell me no all day long, but then at least I know that I tried. And that's kind of how I approach everything. It gets me in a lot of trouble, but at the same time, I get a lot of results. You throw enough spaghetti at the wall and sooner or later something sticks.
I love that though, because especially in the creative world, we have so many ideas and so many stories and so many projects that we want to get out. And I think fear stops a lot of people, right? Fear of self-doubt, but also fear of what if I get told no? So the fact that you're able to take that head on and just approach it, I love that.
Well, I think writers in general, we're all introverts, right? That's one of the reasons why we write. We like the idea of being at a desk all by ourselves and not having to deal with other people. But the truth of it is, there's a whole business side to this thing. You don't get to just write a book and mail it off to your agent like they did back in the good old days. That writing the book is just a small piece of everything else you've got to do. So you've got to be comfortable with the business side. You've got to be comfortable with making contacts and working those contacts. In a lot of ways, I pay it forward as much as I can. I try to help as many people as I can because you never know when you might have to turn around and ask that person for help on something. So, I think we all kind of work together in this community.
Yeah, speaking of working together, you co-wrote Dracul with Dacre, and I know you've co-written books with other authors. How does that process work for you? Like, I'm assuming it's a good process because you continue to do it, but is it difficult to navigate at first?
Yeah, well, I had mentioned earlier, my parents forced me to go into the corporate job. So ultimately, I ended up working in finance. I was the chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds. But I would come home at night and I would write. But I wasn't able to put my own name on projects, mainly because it would just cross over into the corporate world too much. I was worried about what would happen, if my name started showing up on bookshelves and things like that. So I worked as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, literally behind the scenes all the time. I worked with tons of people writing memoirs, writing autobiographies and biographies. I would help people finish their books. If an author needed help getting over the finish line, agents would hire me sometimes. Let's say a book gets submitted to them and they absolutely love it, but it needs, this one little thing needs to be fixed, and the author wasn't capable of doing it. They would hire me to come in and do it. I worked for a lot of editors in New York doing that. So literally for 20 some years, I did all these things. So I came up in this world working with other people. Every book that I worked on was a collaboration. So when I sat down to write Forsaken, my very first novel, to me, that was a weird experience because all of a sudden I am alone at a desk and I don't have anybody else that I'm working with. So when it came to working with somebody like Dacre Stoker, I basically did what I typically do. We met, we discussed what our skill sets are, we figured out who's good at what. It's almost like having two cooks in the kitchen, if making breakfast. If you've got two people trying to make eggs at the same time, you end up tripping over each other. But if one person is making bacon while the other one makes eggs, then everything works out. So in Dacre's case, he used to be a teacher, a history teacher. He was also a tennis pro, which are two very different things. But in his writing style is very much like a teacher. It's extremely detailed, but it's extremely dry. Like he can give you step-by-step instructions on everything. He's going to provide it down to the most minute detail. It's all going to be there, but it's not like a thriller. It's not going to get people to turn pages. That's kind of where I came in. So ultimately, we realized that I needed to write the book, but he was there as a knowledge base. So if I needed to know, what Bram Stoker's bedroom looked like when he was 6 years old, Dacre was able to tell me right down to the pieces of furniture and where they were in the room. So like that was huge because who else can do that? So we pulled from that and put it all together, and I think that's why it works.
I love how, speaking of just describing the spaces in your new book, I just love how you describe the house and everything, and it's a place that I want to go. I know that there's something we'll probably get into here in a minute, but the contest, right? To stay at that house. But I actually watched another podcast that you were on, and it was about that. It was about the house and how I think you said that people put the people that designed they put stuff in the house, right? They furnished it the way you wrote it.
Yeah, so this was, a lot of these things come together in very weird ways. So I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth in New England called Newcastle. And every day I go for a run. When I finish up the writing at 3 o'clock, my quitting bell rings and I go for a run. I do a lap around the island. And at one point I cross the beach. And when I'm standing out on the beach, if I look out over the water, about a quarter mile out is a much smaller island. It's only about an acre. There's one house on it. And that was basically, it became the basis for this book. I spent the first year living out here just, staring at that place going, well, what if, because it's just far enough out, like where you can't tell what's going on out there. You'd occasionally see somebody in the house. You might see a light come on, a light turn off, but you can't really tell what's happening out there. So that just kind of got my author brain going. I later learned that it was, the last time it was actually used, it was a Coast Guard life-saving station. But this was way back in the 40s and 50s. It had basically been abandoned ever since then, and it was falling apart. And a local guy took it upon himself to, basically bring it back to life. He raised around $6 million and, 5 or 6 years worth of construction. And he was able to do that. And I got to know him really well when I was writing the book. So initially he gave me the floor plans for the house. So I had those in front of me when I was actually writing, so I could make sure I could describe the rooms. But at the time, the rooms were literally, taken down to the studs. There was nothing else there. So I had to kind of fill in those blanks. And what's cool with, basically what you just mentioned is they've taken it a step further. Like now they're at the point where they're furnishing the house and they're finishing it up, and they're using my book as the basis for that. So the furniture and things like that I have in the story, they're basically matching in the original house. So it's really cool. We just did the book release party out there for the book is called Something I Keep Upstairs. It released on May 13th. We did the release party on the island, and it's the first time I've been at the house where it was literally completely done. To me, it's like walking through the story. It's very surreal. You stand in those rooms and like I was there with characters, in my mind, and now all of a sudden I'm standing in this real place. And now they've got people going out there on tours, so fans and stuff can see the house too. So it's just a completely fun experience.
But on the marketing material that we received, one of the log lines is Stanley Hotel inspired The Shining, 1974 house in Amityville found infamy. So for the Wood Island home, has there been activity or lore associated with it that is inspiring these stories?
Yeah, that's normally I could write a book in like 3 to 4 months. I'm pretty quick. This one took me almost 4 years from start to finish. And a lot of that was because I would learn something new about this house, and then I would kind of have to put it aside to figure out exactly how that played into the story. I found lore dating back 400 years on this place. Because in New England, everything is old. I lived in Florida for years and years. Everything is, been there for 10 minutes because a hurricane wiped it out 30 minutes earlier. Like everything is brand new there. Like up here in New England, everything has been around for a very long time. But that island, like at one point, it was used as a quarantine zone during yellow fever. So they would literally ship people out to that island when they had yellow fever, and they would leave them out there to die. During the Spanish-American War, if they captured a vessel, they would dock it out there, and they'd force everybody to stay on the boat until everybody either died of starvation or disease, and then they would take the boat. They threw the bodies overboard and fed them to the sharks. So like I found all these, stories like this, over centuries of all these horrific things that happened out in that place. And then when you start talking to the locals, you've got all of those stories. You've got, there's a little girl that people have seen on the beach. So many different people have claimed to seen her. And there's no reason for a little girl to be on this beach ever. Like it's a very difficult, like it's close to the mainland or close to our island. It's a quarter mile out, but it's very deceiving because the water there is filled with granite. There's lots of sharp rocks pointing up all over the place. So you have to know how to navigate those waters in order to get to it. You can only do it at certain times during the day when the tide is at a certain level. If it's too low, you can't make that trip. And if it's too high, the waves are too high and it's too dangerous. During the winter, it's near impossible. So it's just one of those places that you don't see a lot of people out at. So like even when they were saying that, like lights and stuff turning on in the house, like people have stories about that when there was no electricity at the house. Like there's no reason for lights to be going on and off. During the construction and the renovation, a lot of the workers said that they heard people upstairs. They heard people in this hallway. And on the second floor, there's an entire room that had bunk beds in it. And then there's a hallway that had lockers for the Coast Guard employees. And like they swear that they heard the Coast Guard people upstairs, even though there was nobody up there. So we found so many stories just like that. I incorporated as much of it as I possibly could into the book. But now we've got a lot of paranormal investigators that are looking at the island, which is really cool. One of the craziest stories I heard, I found a newspaper article from 1972. Somebody was out there picnicking and they found two bodies on the beach. So they called the local police, and at the time they called Kittery, Maine. The island is right on it's like right on the border of Maine and New Hampshire. So like they called Kittery first. The Kittery police came out there. They said, no, this is Portsmouth territory. So they basically pointed across the water and said, these guys have to take care of it. Portsmouth came out. They said, no, it's not ours. It's yours. Like it was this hot potato. In real life, law enforcement, they don't want to deal with murders. They don't want to deal with bodies. Ultimately, they decided this was a federal issue. So the FBI came in, and there's a photo that's in this article, and the FBI is there. There's the district attorney is standing there. It's like we know this happened, but in today's world, nobody's got a record of it. I contacted all the local police departments. Nobody's got a file on it. They've got no mention of it whatsoever. I contacted the FBI, and I've got friends that work at the FBI. I write thrillers, so you get to know everybody in this world. There's no file. There's no data. Nobody's got any information on it. Nobody knows what happened to those two bodies. But again, there's photos, so like we know this happened. So the good news is with the book coming out, it's caused so much buzz. The FBI has reopened the investigation, and now they're basically investigating themselves, trying to figure out what happened to this material. The general thinking is, this was the 70s. It's probably in a file box somewhere. These bodies are probably in a case on a shelf in an ME's office somewhere. They're confident they're going to find it. I'm hoping that maybe if we do find the bodies through DNA, they might be able to identify them. But like all these things just kind of cropped up, and they all became part of the story.
What we don't know is the hot potato next was they're like, well, it was international waters, so it went over to Scotland Yard.
It's pretty close. That's what it's funny because on TV, like the cops always fight. It's my murder. I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it. And like everybody wants it. But in real life, like they don't want the paperwork. They don't want the headache, and they don't want the stats. If it doesn't seem like something they can solve, they don't want it on their blotter.
You mentioned you have friends in the FBI because being in the thriller world, you built those resources, and you also were in the financial world for a while. How did you freelance into that world, being that you were in corporate America? I know a lot of people have their day jobs or what they call their muggle jobs while trying to be creative. So how were you able to navigate into the creative world while still being in that?
I honestly, I never really stopped. So I went off to college. One of my first jobs, I was in Fort Lauderdale. I worked for BMG Distribution and RCA Records. If they had a recording artist that came into town, I'd have to pick them up at the airport and get them to their concert, get them to the radio station, get them to their hotel, and get them back on an airplane. If you ever saw that movie, Get Them to the Greek, it was very much like that. Like that was my life. Yeah. But to really date myself, this was people like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson and New Kids on the Block. Then we had all the hair bands, Bon Jovi, Jovi, Motley Crue, Poison, Guns N' Roses. Like if I had Guns N' Roses in Fort Lauderdale for a week and nobody got arrested and I got them back on an airplane, like that was a win. But at the same time, I was in college studying business and studying finance, which is expensive. And I realized, I've got some very famous people in the car with me, sometimes for days or a week at a time. So I started to interview them, and then I would sell those interviews to newspapers and magazines, like Teen Beat, 17 Magazine, People Magazine, stuff like that. So that's kind of how I broke into the written industry. And when you work for newspapers and magazines, you quickly learn that everybody's got a book, at some stage of development in a desk drawer somewhere. It's 400,000 words. They've been working on it for the last 10 years. It's almost done, but they feel it needs a little something. I became the guy that they would show those to. I was really good with grammar and punctuation, so initially I would just kind of help with that. Then I started to offer developmental suggestions and things to help them, turn that pile of paper into a legitimate story that they could sell. And that just eventually evolved into, the side hustle as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So I never stopped doing that. I would work the corporate job during the daytime, and then I would come home at night and I would work on all these projects to keep myself sane. The real kicker for me is over those 20 some years, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list that I had written, but they all came out with other people's names on the cover. That gets very old after a while. So when that 6th one came, hit up, my wife pulled me aside and she said, listen, I know you want to be a full-time author. Let's find a way to make this happen. But at that point, we were kind of stuck. We had a big house in Florida. We had cars. We had a boat. And we had all the expenses associated with that lifestyle. So we couldn't just pick up and leave. We had to do something drastic. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh. We rented out one side to some tenants, and we moved into the other side and basically got to the point where we could live off of savings, so I could quit the job, live off of savings long enough to write that first book. And that's when I cranked out Forsaken.
What a story. Wow.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit what you were talking about with the famous people, driving them around, because that's actually what I do part-time, and I'm always worried, like can I talk about it? Like, obviously you sold these stories that you had, but like is there some kind of legality involved when it's like you're a fly on the wall and you're listening to these people talk or do whatever they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I was very clear, like, this is what we're, if we're going to talk, this is what we're talking about, this is where it's going to go. Because you do have to draw that line. If you're a driver, in a lot of ways, you disappear, in that environment. You're behind that driver's seat. They don't even know you're there anymore. They're in the back seat talking about who knows what. And that stuff I never discussed. I mean, I heard so many crazy things that I would never, ever repeat. So they always knew they were on the record. The memoirs that I wrote, like, I literally I was at a Miami Dolphins football game. I was down on the field. I through a friend of mine, I'd gotten some tickets on the field. I walked up to a very famous player and we were just talking. And I asked him, like, have you ever considered writing a book about your life? And he said that he gets approached for that kind of thing all the time, but he's not a writer. He doesn't have the time to do it. So it just never happened. So we ultimately struck a deal where, I agreed to write the book. His agent shopped the book and we split the advance on it, which was a pretty sizable dollar amount. So that's how I broke into the whole memoir thing. So famous people in general, I mean, like if you walk down, that aisle at Barnes and Noble, chances are the people on the cover, the people the book is about, they're not the ones who wrote it. It was somebody like me. So I would sit down with like a politician. We would talk for like 2 days. I'd record all those conversations and I would transcribe it. And then I would write a, first person account in their voice and get that book together. So, if you approach famous people, a lot of them are very open to that sort of thing.
How do you determine what project you want to devote your time and energy to? Because you've got that world, right, where you're writing about what you've experienced while getting everybody to the Greek, writing about the furry walls. But you also have the thriller side and the true crime side. And just how do you decide this is what I'm going to really put all my energy into?
Well, at this point, it's all 100% fiction, and it's all stuff that I know is going to come out with my name on the cover. I don't do the other stuff anymore. And a lot of it is dictated by the market itself. So at one point, my agent told me that my audience was women 45 and over. And she's like, that's who you need to write to. And like the first thought that popped into my head is, well, how do I expand my audience? How do I get somebody else? So I wrote a young adult book. And then all of a sudden, the next time we had that conversation, hey, your audience is 18 and over. So like I constantly, I use the book as almost like a calling card, like a business card. Right now I'm working with a ton of co-authors, so I'm branching out into other areas. I've got co-authors that are working on, they're primarily thrillers, but will include elements of sci-fi, elements of horror, elements of romance, all these different things. So I can kind of reach out into these different piles of readers, almost like a literary Pied Piper. I expand my audience, and I use the books to do it.
I think that keeps everything interesting, right? You're never stuck in one particular genre. You're kind of all over the place. And one thing I was thinking about is specifically in the thriller or horror genre, or the paranormal. Are there places that you go to that influence particular books? I mean, obviously, something I keep upstairs is one particular place. Are there other places that you're just like, or maybe someplace new that you're thinking about writing about?
I mean, I'm always visiting places like that. I mean, I spent the night once in a former prison in Belglade, Florida, just because it was supposed to be haunted. So me and a group of people, we got to spend the night there. And like when that opportunity came up, I wasn't going to say no. I love to do that kind of thing. I went out to the Stanley Hotel once with my wife for a horror. It wasn't really a convention. I guess it was kind of like a writer's retreat. The Stanley Hotel was the basis for The Shining. At one point, I wrote the final scene for The Fourth Monkey, which is one of my thrillers, in the same room that Stephen King had stayed in. Mainly just to try and get the vibe. We were down in the basement of that place reading scary stories to each other at midnight. Trying to scare something up, and like nothing happened. Like I have yet to like have an actual legit paranormal experience, but I've been in many places that have freaked me out. Where like I feel like even Wood Island. Like the first time I went out there, I knew nothing about it. I was standing in literally a house that was in the middle of a renovation. It looked like something out of HGTV, but like every bone in my body was like screaming, "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Like my body like instinctually did not want to be there. Then I learned all these things that had happened on that island. After the fact, I heard about all these things, and I started to research this, and there's a lot of theories about it. Like if you're in a room with a cat and like there's a loud noise in the corner of the room, that cat is going to bolt. It doesn't care what made the noise. It just disappears. It'll figure it out later. People are stupid. Like we have learned to tune that out. Like we will walk to the corner of the room. We will sniff it out. We will try to figure out what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a threat or not. Like we've like taken that instinct and kind of weeded it out of our personalities. So like if you stand in a room and like the hair on the back of your neck is standing up, and like every instinct in your body is telling you to get out, like there's a reason for that. We don't necessarily know what that reason is, but like I've learned to appreciate it. And I've been in a lot of places that have brought up that particular type of feeling, and a lot of them tend to be old. Tend to be places where a lot of people died or something tragic happened. And you don't need to know that fact going in. Like you'll have that feeling, and then when you research the place, you'll find that this happened or that happened. Here in New England, we've got plenty of examples of those things. They're all over the place. We've had a lot of paranormal investigators out at Wood Island since this book came out, and the general thinking is that energy, everything is made of energy, and when something dies, that energy just gets displaced. It moves from one thing to another. It doesn't disappear. So if you have a lot of things die in one particular place, it's almost like a battery. Like that charge gets absorbed into that location. Which explains a lot. It makes a lot of sense. I'm smart enough to know there's a lot that I don't know. So I'm willing to keep an open mind.
Is there an area, because you've gone into supernatural, paranormal, thriller, is there an area of that kind of supernatural world that you haven't written about yet that you'd like to tap into?
Not necessarily. Like I try to follow all of it. I haven't done anything with telekinesis yet, which I think would be kind of fun. I'm waiting for the right story. Like for this one, like I knew for years I wanted to write a haunted house story, but I didn't want to write the same haunted house story that I've seen a million times. A family buys a house, they move into a house, something weird happens, they learn that something bad happened, something more weird happens. Like it's just like we've seen that same movie, that same story over and over again. So in this book, like the tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die, and it's all about a kid who inherits a house that's not haunted. haunted. It's a perfectly normal house. Him and his friends decide that they want to make it a haunted house. So they start right where you would expect. There's a couple scary stories. There's a Ouija board, but that tagline, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So you know where they're going with this whole thing. But the book itself is the journey, and that's where the fun is. So I need, if I'm going to write about something like that, something paranormal or whatever, like I need to find a unique twist on it, something that nobody's done before. That's the part that grabs me, and that's what makes me want to write it.
Yeah, I like I've been listening to it, but Thursday or Chloe, I like how you use that character to explain it all, right? To really tap into, like, okay, this is the paranormal, this is what I believe, and it kind of opens it up to the group, and then they kind of talk about what they believe or not believe. Does that, obviously it's fiction, but do your beliefs in that kind of stuff influence it? Or is it just kind of, well, this is the story I read about it, and this is how I want to portray it? Is there any kind of influence from that, from your own beliefs?
No, honestly, if I were part of that story, if I was in that room with them, I would be the skeptic. I would be the one taking Chloe and shooting down every theory that she has. Characters for me are very weird. Before I start writing a book, I basically research these people. I create, very well-rounded individuals. To me, they are real people by the time I start writing that story. That gives them a unique voice, but it basically means that I can drop into, them into any particular scenario, and I can follow their lead. They're going to tell the story to me, and I'm more an observer. I'm just writing it down. So like Chloe may say a lot of things that I disagree with, but that's her perspective on it. Same thing with the other ones. They may say something I agree with or I don't agree with. They're not, like it's hard to explain, without sounding schizophrenic. They're not like pieces of me. They are different people in this story, and I'm a complete outside observer.
Do you ever have difficulty letting characters go once you're done with a piece?
Yeah, I do, and I think it's partly because a lot of times when I read a book, especially by somebody who's a first-time author, that book has a beginning, middle, and end, and like they started as if nothing has ever been, nothing has happened in this character's life until that book started. You know what I mean? Like it's like you walk into that room and it's like that's where their story, their life begins, their story and their life ends with that book. But that's not like real life. Like if you drop into any scenario in real life, you're walking into the middle of something and you're leaving in the middle of something. Things continue to happen afterwards. So for me, even if a story feels like it comes to a conclusion, if that character is still alive, they continue to live their life. They continue to to move on. So those characters are always out there. Like I one of my best my trilogies is 4MK, the 4MK thriller trilogy. I get a lot of requests from people. Like, am I going to continue that storyline? And like I can honestly say, like Sam Porter, the lead detective, like I can almost picture him in the corner of my office tapping his foot going, hey, you're not done yet. Like this happened and you haven't told anybody. So yeah, it's hard to explain to somebody who's, are you guys authors? Like, are you writers? Like that particular tribe sort of gets it. If I talk to readers, they look at me like I'm a crazy person.
Yeah, there's so much you have to choose to keep out and put in. Like you said, when you have a character that you're writing, you know more than what you're going to put into the book of what shaped that character, what they're going through. And so it's fun that though you can kind of picture yours just being like, let's go. We have more stories you didn't tell.
Well, I think in order to craft a good book, you have to work with real people. I mentor a lot of authors. So one of the tricks that I learned years ago is, rather than creating a character from scratch, base it on an actor or an actress. Take somebody like Ben Affleck, somebody you've seen in a million different movies, his mannerism, his speech patterns, how the guy walks. That makes it very easy to drop him into a story. And then, eventually your character will find a life of their own, but it gives you a good starting point. A lot of authors will use real people in their life, and I've done that too. But you have to know them like on that level. If you just create a character, literally just pick a name and give them an age and just kind of hit the paper and start running, every character in your book is going to sound the same. I think the real test is if you were to take three of your characters and put them in a room and and then ask them a question, you should get three different answers, just like you would if you were to ask three real people, the same question. Everybody should respond differently. If you're getting the same answer, then their characters are basically paper characters. They're extensions of yourself. They're, you're not there yet. One of the examples I always tell people is like Sam Porter, my lead detective in the 4MK series. I could drop him at the entrance to Disney World, and I know what ride he's going to go on first. I know what the guy is going to eat for lunch. I know what he's going to think about. It's a Small World when he gets off that ride, and how much he's going to hate that song. Like I know his personality enough, where I understand all these things about him. None of this stuff would ever make it into a book, but it's important to know your characters, I think, on that level in order to make them seem real.
I think that's amazing advice, and that's something. And we are, to answer your question, yeah, me and Ashley do script writing and things like that for,
Okay.
for film stuff. And yeah, that was another bit of advice I got as a filmmaker when I was doing the writing stuff. Is that, yeah, like don't make your characters just like a plot device or something that moves the story forward necessarily. Like give them their own agency, give them their own, like take a character that doesn't belong in your story, put them in there and make it interesting. Like, I don't know. I think that's great.
That's honestly, I've got a lot of respect for you guys because I know how difficult writing a screenplay is. Like when I write a book, I can get in the character's head. I can describe what they're thinking, what they're feeling, all these different things that you can't do. Like you have to show everything either through action or through their dialogue and make it come across. And I had a book called A Caller's Game. Where I initially wrote this thinking, like everything up until that point had gotten optioned by folks in Hollywood. So I'm like, I'm going to write a book that can't be filmed just to see what happens. So I write this book where I blow up like half of New York, and immediately Ridley Scott's company optioned it. So like that was out the window. And then at one point they asked me if I wanted to write the screenplay. So I sat down and wrote out my screenplay, and it was 4.5 hours long. And, like my problem is like when I write a book, I trim away the fat. I get it to the leanest piece of meat, as possible before I put that book out. Like that is the story. I've taken out all the fluff. And you kind of have to take that to another level. You've got to take that book and take it down to 1.5 hours. So you got to start taking even more out. You've got to combine characters. You've got to take storylines out. You got to figure out what's really, really, really important in that book and just show that. And none of that is easy to do.
Yeah, so similar to what you have done as like what did you call it, a book doctor?
Yeah.
I've helped people with their scripts, clean up their scripts and format their scripts. And so, is that a script doctor? But
It might be.
but I can always tell my friends that come to me. I can always tell the ones that are book writers. Because I'm like, this is lovely, this is beautiful, this is descriptive. I'm sorry I have to destroy all of that. Because that's just, it's pretty much, rule of thumb. It changes depending on what type, if it's action, sequence, and so forth. But rule of thumb is usually 1 page of script is 1 minute of filming, or 1 minute of film. So typically, so when you get like a book, it's like I have to take this beautiful 300-page book and now turn it into 80 pages or 90 pages. And it's hard because as a writer, I'm sure, the beauty that you get from world building and being able to really dive into characters has to get scrubbed away, but that sentiment still needs to exist in there. But now it has to be shown through dialogue and character interaction.
Yeah, I'm honest. Like when Fourth Monkey was coming out, it was making its rounds at the publishers, and like there was a ton of Hollywood interest. And one of my very first phone calls was with Ron Howard's company, and they went through that same thing. They started telling me everything they were going to have to take out of that book in order to get it to an hour and 46 minutes on the screen. And honestly, it scared me a little bit. This was years back. This was around 2017 or so, and things have changed a lot over the years, and now everything is leaning towards streaming. And what I'm finding is like I am really liking that world a lot better because they can take a book, turn it into 8 to 10 episodes, and not only do they get your entire story out, the streaming, the writers behind that are coming to me asking for the stuff that ended up on my cutting room floor. Like what material do I have that didn't make the book? Like they want to see that and find some way to include that. I honestly I like that world a lot better than I do the feature world.
I'm excited to see that emerging. I know they recently announced they're going to be doing that with Stephen King's Carrie. It's going to be like an 8-episode streaming miniseries. And, a lot of people are like, oh, no, don't touch it. But Stephen King's on board. They pitched, here's how we're going to put it together. And he's on board with it as well. So I'm with you. It's fun to see things that were really great books now getting another chance so we can expand into that world more.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been so great, and I was just going to mention that, like TV has been so great for books, like stories like Penny Dreadful. We've talked about that before, and just to bring all these characters together, to give them room to have their own story. You can't do it in one movie. You got to do it in a series. Otherwise, it's not going to be it's not going to be worth it. It's not going to be earned. It's not doing justice to the characters. And for books, for if you're going to do a book and you're going to show it to people in that format, it should be, maybe a 3-part movie or maybe a series. I don't know. I agree. It is the hardest thing to do. And that's why so many movies fail, is because they're just trying to just condense everything, and then they miss some of the major points in the book. So
Now, if you had to pick one of your babies, which one would you turn into a series?
Oh man, that's a tough question. So I've got 8 different projects in what I call various stages of Hollywood hell. It's like this one's got a director, this one's got a showrunner, this one's got a star, this one just lost its star. Like every time my phone rings, if it's my film agent, it's always something really good or something really bad. There's no in between with those guys. Everything that I've written has been optioned on some level, which is crazy to think about, with the exception of my very first book, Forsaken. And honestly, it's because of the Stephen King thing. Like we haven't talked about that, but in the book, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. So just to get the book done, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there, and fully expected to have to change that. I just kind of did it as a placeholder. But ultimately, we got King's permission to use it. He liked the book enough where he let me leave all those references in there. So what ends up happening is when the folks in Hollywood read that book, they get excited about making like a quick, hour and a half long scary movie out of it. But then they realize that it's got this Stephen King tie-in, and Needful Things is optioned by another company. So now the lawyers step in and go, well, we're going to have to untangle this because it's part of this and it's part of that world. And and then everybody just kind of backs away slowly. So I would love to see them find a way to make that movie. But it hasn't happened yet. My favorite book is, I've got a book called She Has a Broken Thing Where Her Heart Should Be, which is a crazy long title. Everybody hated the title. Everybody hated the book from a business standpoint when I put it out. My agent's like, this is never going to sell. It's too long. It was like almost 1,000 pages. It was that young adult book that I had mentioned. And ultimately, the book came out and it did really well. And like when I travel the world now, like that is the book that people put down in front of me and say, this is my favorite. This is my favorite. Like I have heard that from literally everywhere on the globe. So I would love to see that one get made. And it's basically a retelling of Great Expectations, which is probably my all-time favorite book.
With your storytelling, what would you say you pull inspiration from most? Would it be the classics, or is it just a little bit of everything?
I think it really does come down to the classics. That was some of the earliest stuff that I read. So I read all the Mark Twain stuff, Charles Dickens, all those books that, at the time, like in the library, like that's what was there, so I just kind of, I started reading anything I could get my hands on. But those are the stories that I keep going back to. I mean, like, if I look, I'm 54 years old now. If I look at the books that I've read more than once, it's just the classics. There's nothing else really on that list. So I think I pulled very heavily from those. And those people pulled from the stuff that came before them. It's funny how that works, but everybody's inspired by the generations that came prior.
Now, when you think about these books that you write and them turning into movies or TV shows, is there any particular actor that you've had in mind for that? Or do they ask you? Is there like somebody that you're like, I really wish this actor would play this character because that's who could do the best job for this character?
I had mentioned earlier that sometimes I'll take an actor or an actress as the basis for a character. So when I wrote A Caller's Game, I had Jessica Chastain in mind, like the entire time I was writing it. So her personality, it's about a radio DJ. She's on Sirius XM. She's a talk show host, very similar to like a female Howard Stern. And she's on the air one morning and somebody calls in and confesses to murder and then commits a murder live on the air. So she has to keep him on the air while all this is going on. So I think that was one of the reasons why I had trouble, whittling that down to a shorter movie, because it's so dialogue heavy, like everything is done over the air. The audiobook is fantastic just because they're able to do it almost like a radio play. But I had Jessica Chastain in mind, the entire time I was writing it. What I find is that in the Hollywood side, most of this comes down to scheduling. They get the writer, they get the showrunner, they get all these different pieces that have to come together. But when it comes to the talent, it's basically, who is available between this date and this date. And then your pool gets very small. Every time one of my books goes out to, they start shopping it out there, like I'll usually get a PDF document, like here's all the actors that we're considering. And it's literally everybody in Hollywood, like everybody you could possibly think of, from The Rock all the way down to, somebody who just popped up, on some, soap opera 2 weeks ago. And they're just casting a wide net because nobody knows. It's really going to come down to who's available February 2027.
Is there a specific writing routine that you keep to? I know you mentioned 3:00, the bell hits and it's time for the run, but is there a specific writing routine you keep to in general?
I do now because I do this full time now. So I get up at the crack of 7 in the morning. I told myself when I left the corporate world, I'd never set an alarm before 7 again. So I get up at 7, I grab my coffee, I head straight to my desk, and I turn off the internet, first thing. I don't look at anything online. I don't let any email come in. And I just knock out the words on whatever project I'm working on. From a routine standpoint, I tend to read whatever I wrote the previous day and I edit it and clean it up. So I do about 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. So I'll go through that. And by the time I get to the end of that, basically my head is 100% in the story. So I can just kind of keep going and going and going. I'll write until about 10:30 or 11. Then I hit that 2,000 to 3,000 word mark. I found that I can go more, like I can write more, but like at some point, like I'm squeezing water out of a rock. Like there's only so much creativity I can get going in the day. So that seems to be my sweet spot. That's when I turn the internet on, let my inbox fill up with all the business side of this, so the agent things, interviews, and publisher questions and all that kind of stuff. I deal with that until 3, and that's when the quitting bell rings. I go for that run around the island, and then I spend the rest of the night with my wife and daughter. When I first started doing this, I used to, I'm in about 150 different countries. So I used to get interview requests at all kinds of crazy hours. This one would come in at like 2:00 in the morning, 11:00 at night. And I would take all of them because I felt like that's what you're supposed to do. But I quickly realized I was going to burn out, like if I didn't change that. So I force everybody into my tiny little window now. Like they have to schedule before 3:00 or I can't do it.
We can relate to that. We were scheduling people for many seasons where it's just whatever their availability was. And finally, we're like, these are our recording days. We'll make exceptions, but mostly this is what we try to stick to, just for, like you said, not burning out, because definitely that candle can burn really quickly.
Well, and honestly, there's things that are more important, right? Like family to me is the most important thing. So I don't want to miss out. Like my dad was barely present when I was growing up, and I don't want to be that guy. I want to make sure I'm with my wife and daughter as much as I can.
Now, has that writing bug trickled down to your daughter?
Every time I ask her what she wants to be when she grows up, she tells me a veterinarian.
I love that.
So she's going to this really cool elementary school. It's right across the street from our house, and they're actually teaching them how to write books in class. And it's really cool how they're doing it. So they'll give them, some papers, and they'll like ask some questions, and they kind of research their book. But they create a beginning, a middle, and an end. They teach them how to illustrate each of those things. And like at the end of the day, they've got a finished book that, like I know plenty of adult authors that can't come up with a beginning, middle, and an end. So like they're teaching them this skill set at a very early age, but it hasn't been something that she's gravitated towards. She just kind of recently figured out what I actually do. Like now she's kind of wrapping her head around it. So like when we go out to dinner, like the waitress will ask her what she wants for dinner, and she'll say, "My dad is a famous book writer." Like that will be her response, which is super cool. And then recently when we did the book release for Something I Keep Upstairs, she was out there with me and she signed every copy right along with me. So I think she got a little taste of what it's like to sit at that table and have a couple hundred people come up to you and ask you to sign something. So I'm trying to sway her into my camp. It hasn't quite happened yet. Being a vet, I guess, is very attractive, but we'll see where it goes.
Now, do you guys, you said you travel all over the place. Are you still traveling quite a bit, or do you get to just kind of do as much or as little as you want to? Can you just stay where you are? Or?
Yeah, it's one of those things like, before you start publishing books, like you want to travel, as an author, like it just seems very cool, like something you want to do. Let's see the world. But when you actually put it into practical use and you realize how much time is involved, how tiring it is, how much time away from home, like it gets exhausting. And, like if I could take my wife and daughter with me, it would be one thing. But, 99% of the time my daughter's in school, my wife is busy. We can't just pick up and go for that kind of thing. So it kind of came to a head right before COVID. And then when COVID hit, then everything everything went to Zoom, because Zoom really didn't exist really before COVID. Like there were different ways to video conference, but Zoom really came alive during COVID. So all those interviews and those, bookstore appearances, book club appearances, all those things, they all went to Zoom. And I think the publishers really wanted them to stay there because it's way cheaper to do a Zoom call than it is to send somebody on an airplane, halfway around the world. But what they're finding is it's just not as effective as having the author in that room, at a bookstore in Italy or wherever. So I'm finding that the travel is ramping back up. I'm actually leaving for Greece in about a week. I'm going to Belgium, I guess about 2 months from now. So I've got about 4 or 5 more international trips planned. I don't do as much domestically as I probably should. I love a good road trip. At some point I'm probably going to hop in my car and do something across the country. But, at this point when a book releases, I tend to hit the same markets everybody else does. New York, Boston, Chicago, maybe LA if I've got time. I would love to get out there and see some of those smaller towns.
Being that you have segued a bit more into the paranormal side of the house, are there other famous paranormal places that you'd like to visit and potentially be inspired to write about?
I don't know. I feel like I kind of got that one out of my system. But you never know, like something weird may happen. Like that's what it's going to take. Like I'm going to have to go someplace, some unique experience is going to have to happen. And it's going to have to be compelling enough to put down on paper. If it's something that somebody else has experienced, to me, like it's not worth writing about. And one of the things that I find in a lot of these places is everybody experiences the same thing. Even when you go out to like the Stanley Hotel, they've got 4 or 5 key stories that they tell everybody. These are the things that we saw. These are, this is what's happening out here. And that's already been written about. So like I don't want to rehash something that's been done. It's going to have to be something unique. So I'm not going to write it off, but you never know. Like when that bug strikes, it's going to have to be something different.
As you're writing, but I know you have your routine and you work on the project that is your main full-time project at the time. Do you ever have any other stories that kind of pop up for you that you're like, oh, I got to get something about that story out just so you have reference for later?
Yeah, so I write a lot of books with a guy named James Patterson, and
nobody's ever heard of that guy.
Yeah, he's this hack writer out of New York. No, we've had just as many conversations on the writing side and business side, as all these other things. And like he's kind of taught me a lot about his business model. And we're very similar in a lot of ways. And I'm working with a ton of co-authors right now. I just created my own imprint at Simon and Schuster. So I'm actually working on. I think I've got 8 different books that I'm working on right now with various co-authors. I like keeping busy. So like I've got my main title that I'm writing. I do that first thing in the morning. I've usually got one that I'm editing. Then I've got the co-author titles that I'm working on. I've got another one I'm working on with Jim. So I've always got multiple books going. And what I find is that, if I get stuck on one, if I run into a corner, I'm not sure where to go with it, I can put it aside and I can pick up one of these other ones. Like once you've got that model in place, it's easy enough to jump back and forth. As long as there's new books coming out and you keep that pipeline filled, nobody really cares, which one you're working on when. So rather than sit down and force myself to work on one particular title that I may not be into at that given moment, I can work on something else. So it's nice to have multiple projects going.
That just seems so hard to do, like having so many different projects, so many different characters. You'd be like, oh, wait a minute, this character's from this story. Like I would have to have like a wall of like chaos to try to put it all together.
Serial killer wall.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that's why I like working with co-authors. Like the ones that I find, they've got a specific skill set that I don't necessarily have. So like I wrote a book about a year ago called Heavy Are the Stones with a woman named Christine Daigle. In real life, she's a neuropsychologist. So she was able to bring that skill set to the writing table. And like I can fake my way through being a neuropsychologist on paper. I can, do enough Google searches, watch a couple of Netflix documentaries and kind of pull it off. But if you've got that authentic voice in the writing room, you can't beat that. So every one of my co-authors has basically got a different background. So to me, that's how that part of it stays interesting. I'm using all these different people. All of them are completely different. The only time I've honestly run into what you're talking about, when I was writing that prequel to Dracula, I was also under contract for my second book in the 4MK thriller series. So I would work on the Dracula prequel in the morning, and then I would have to work on a serial killer in Chicago story in the afternoon. So like Victorian English started to creep into my Chicago book, and like pizza would work its way into Dracula. So things got a little dicey there for a while. But if they're all similar vibes, it's easy enough for me to jump from one to the next.
Do you have to do a lot of research, for example, like the Victorian English, when you're writing these different books to make sure you're true to that? Or is most of it pretty modern that it doesn't have to be as, in-depth researched?
I try not to go down a research rabbit hole, where I'm on Google for 3 hours out of the day. So I do just enough to make it authentic. So if I've got to describe a particular building in Chicago, I can load up that building. I can look at the floor plans. I can look at the lobby. I'll keep it on the screen long enough for me to write that scene, and then it goes away. But I try not to dwell on it. It's too easy to find some kind of cool topic, and then you load up a YouTube video, and before you know it, you've watched 40 YouTube videos and you haven't gotten any writing done. So I try to be really careful with that.
That's my problem for sure. Do you in addition to that, so you said you have these co-writers that are sometimes experts on the subject. Do you interview other people that are experts besides just like looking at the floor plans and stuff like that? Are there people in that, I have to, like you said, you talked with the FBI, right? Like, are there any other types like psychics or anything like that, or people that you don't maybe normally have contact with that you need to have that kind of pulse for a character?
Yeah, I do that all the time. So like the last book that I wrote with James Patterson was called The Writer. And there was a lawyer that was involved in it, like in the storyline. So I reached out to a friend of mine who's a real attorney, and I had him read some of those pages and just kind of weigh in on the legal side just to make sure I have it accurate. I just finished writing a prequel to, or not a prequel, do you remember the movie Flatliners? From the 90s?
Yes, we love
Yeah,
Outlanders.
so it was this really cool movie. It had Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, Billy Baldwin, Oliver Platt, all these like household names basically before they were famous. Nobody really knew who they were back when this movie came out. I'm working with the guy who wrote the original script, and we just finished up a novel to reboot the franchise in today's world. So that novel is actually being shopped right now by our agents. But there's a ton of medical stuff in there, and I'm not a doctor, so like I would just kind of write it out the way that I see it. But then I brought in actual medical professionals to go through and make sure I'm using the right medications, the right dosage, the dialogue is correct. I always reach out to professionals when it comes to that sort of thing because, like I can come close, like I said, I can fake it. I can get to 90% there, but I really want that extra 10% to make it authentic.
Do you have any like book resource confidants, for lack of a better word, that you can reach out to when you do hit a wall of where does my story go next that you soundboard off of? Or do you just let the story evolve as it evolves?
I mean, if I have to, I'll put that scene away and just put a placeholder in there. I usually throw some brackets up and, like insert this here, make a note to myself to make sure I get that out before it actually gets to the publisher. And then I'll try to find that person. And I've reached out, cold, to people on the internet, just do a quick search. And if I need somebody who worked at an archaeological dig in 1974, I'll try to find that person and, reach out to them. And you'd be surprised who's willing to talk to you. People love books. They love authors. And like the idea of being, involved in that process, most people are very into it.
That's so cool. And again, you don't have fear reaching out to people. So I love that.
You can't. I mean, like worst, either they don't answer your email or they say no, but at least, you tried. And I think that's the important part.
Yeah, and you just keep moving forward.
Yep.
You did mention Flatliners. Do you have a favorite horror movie or something you grew up with that just, like with these classic novels that you read over and over, is there something that you can watch over and over?
Well, my favorite book is Great Expectations, which is not horror at all.
No, but still phenomenal.
Yeah, I love that story, and I've read that book more times than I can count. My favorite movie, you probably never heard of it. It's called Eddie and the Cruisers. Have you heard of this one?
The title sounds familiar.
Yeah, so it's about it came out in the 80s. It's about a rock band in the 50s. They had an album that hit like really really big. Then they had to follow it up, and the lead singer ends up driving his car over a bridge and disappears. They assume he's dead. They never actually find him. They only find the car. So the movie itself is all about a reporter investigating the disappearance of this particular lead singer and just going back, and talking to the original band members and stuff. But the way it's put together is like one of my favorite movies. It's got some fantastic music in it. Like it kind of hits on every chord. I'd love to be able to write something like that, but in the thriller world, and I haven't quite figured out how to do it yet. I know it's coming. I haven't gotten that idea yet.
If anybody can figure it out, it's you.
It'll happen sooner or later.
What is your go-to writing platform for when you write?
I'm all over the board when it comes to that too. So I mainly use Scrivener if I'm working on my Mac. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a typewriter behind me. So I've got a novel that I'm working on that. I basically just do a couple sentences every day. You know, when I walk by, I just add to it. I've got another novel I'm writing out longhand on a pad of paper. And what I find is my voice is different. If I change up the medium, and again, it helps keep it interesting. It keeps it fun. So I change that all the time. I won't write a book in Microsoft Word only because it scares me half to death. Like when the book starts getting really long, it takes like 3 minutes for your computer to open that file, and like it just makes me worried that the file is going to crash. So I will never write one in Microsoft Word, but I will try pretty much anything else.
I love that you use a typewriter. When I was growing up, we had a typewriter, and that was just my favorite thing. It didn't matter what I was writing. And, back then, getting the ribbons, stuff like that, it's pretty difficult. Well, I'm sure it's difficult now, but it's a little easier to Google and find things. But I loved it. I loved the tactile just interaction with the typewriter.
It was the only class in high school that didn't have homework. So I took it every possible year.
BJ, do you have any final questions before we wrap this amazing episode up?
No, I just want to say thank you for coming on. I am getting into your current book right now, and I'm excited to see where it goes. To be honest, I love the characters, just the backstories, and just that house. I want to do a paranormal investigation there. I am so excited I just want to see it. And hopefully I can do that at some point. Get out to New England in that area because I know it's old and awesome.
It's definitely a fun place to visit. You said you're doing the audiobook, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the guy who did the narration on that is phenomenal.
Very good. Yes, I was gonna say that. Like the way he talks, like an old man, like a young girl, like the boy, like everything. It was so
Yeah,
solid. I loved it.
he's got it dialed in. He's one of my favorite narrators, I think, out of all my books.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Now, where can people find out more about any upcoming projects or previous projects that you have out?
Easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. I'm on all the social medias at jdbarker. Latest book, that we've been talking about is something I keep upstairs that released May 13th. Books are pretty much in every bookstore.
You mentioned that you mentor authors. Would they be able to find information about that on the website as well?
I don't mentor anymore, but I am looking for co-authors. So if anybody's interested in that, they can just reach out to me on the contact form on my website and get a dialogue going. We'll see where it leads.
Oh, phenomenal. This has been great. I appreciate you coming on and talking to us about your writing process and your books, and I'm really excited to see what you come out with next. Yeah, this has been great. Do you have any final thoughts, JD, before we wrap it up?
No, thanks for having me. I need to get one of those signs that BJ's got behind him. I like that.
Let's get spooky.
Yeah, that's cool. All right. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate you coming on. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to this episode of 3 Haunted Podcast with your hosts. I'm Ashley Lunar Goddess.
And I'm BJ Segura.
Do you have any questions, comments, or episode suggestions? Please email us at 3hauntedpodcast@gmail.com. And if you haven't done so already, please like, follow, and subscribe to all of our social media. You don't want to miss amazing conversations like this one.
Also, don't forget to check out 3hauntedpodcast.com, where you'll find all of our past and current season episodes, as well as guest information and all kinds of awesome merch.
Until next time.